Hello, and welcome to the Bearded Baron's Workshop. Today, we're going to be talking about how I make leather mugs. The idea is to take a piece of leather that looks like this stuff over here. That is a 10 to 12 ounce, pretty heavy duty piece of leather. And turn it into a leather drinking vessel that looks maybe like this one, maybe not. So, what are the tools that you will need to make this sort of a mug? We've got some of them right here. Some of the most essential pieces. Stitching needles. Now these are called harness needles. You can see that they are pretty thick in gauge and they are quite sharp. The eye on them is not terribly big. I have found that these needles do a much better job for stitching through all of those layers of thick leather than some of the smaller ones that are available because they don't break and the eyes don't break. To go along with those needles, we'll need thread. The thread that I prefer to use is a waxed sinew. In order for those stitches to go in the right places, you will want to have an item like this one. This is called a stitching groover. Not an absolutely essential item, but a pretty handy one to have. You definitely want to find one of these. If you pick it up at an actual leatherworking store like Tandy Leather, they call them AWLs, AWLs. This happens to be an ice pick that I got at a yard sale for 25 cents and has served me faithfully for quite some time. In order to sort of finish out the items that'll be used to actually stitch the leather pieces together, I have a multi-pronged stitching hole punch. And of course, you can either use a pen or a Sharpie or a pencil. You will of course want to have a good pair of leather cutting shears like these. Pretty heavy duty scissors. A razor knife is another good thing to have. Got one of those right there. Making sure to keep your corners square, lines straight. A measuring square like this one is rather handy. A standard ruler will work just as well. All of these pieces are sitting on top of a black mat. This is called Poundo board. It's actually a really hard or dense rubber, and that is so that when you use punching tools, like our multi-prong punch, they go into the Poundo board and it doesn't mar the punching tips. It allows them to stay sharp. And of course, along with the multi-prong punch, you'll want to have something to pound on it. I do not recommend using a metal hammer. Metal hammers will eventually take the end of these and mushroom them out. The metal will start to degrade, and you may strike it at one point with a metal hammer if it keep doing it that way, and a little metal bit will fly off. When metal bits fly off, there's always a chance of them going in somebody's eye, and that is not good. So, I use a leather mallet. That is a piece of rawhide rolled onto the end of a wooden handle. In addition, As you can see, this particular mug has a good bit of artwork on it. So other things that will help us to make that kind of art stuff, I've got a swivel knife here. Swivel knives are used to carve into the leather any sort of design, and just very quickly here, there's a little saddle on the top for folks that haven't used one before. The saddle stays stationary in your finger, and then it allows you to roll the blade around. Gives you a good bit of control. So we're just gonna very quickly here try to do this one-handed. So straight lines, and then you can see that it is actually cutting into the skin of the leather. Yeah, that design looks terribly familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Now that you've seen the bulk of the tools that wind up getting used, we're going to go through the 3 phases of making one of these mugs the way that I make them. There's an artwork phase, and then there's the construction phase, and then there is the sealing phase. So we're going to start with the artwork phase. We go from the large piece of leather, and then you want to cut it to size. Now you're going to wind up cutting a rectangle that you'll turn into a cylinder. My basic mugs measure 7 inches in height and then 13 inches in length. So that is a rectangle that looks about like this. So the next thing that we do is we go through with edge beveling tools, if you have them. This is just another step that sort of adds a level of cleanness, I guess, to a piece of leather, to a project. Edge bevelers look like these. You can see you've got a little prong there, and inside of that prong there is a sharpened piece of the steel. And what that'll do is that'll take our piece of leather and it will take a section off. Sorry. I failed in my preparation. Edge beveler takes off a portion just of the corner of the leather, little noodle-like thing like that, and instead of the squared, freshly cut edge that you see here, the bevel just rounds those corners out. So what you want to do is, if you have them available, you want to bevel your edges at this time. And also, what I have done with this piece is I have taken the stitching groover, and get it a little bit close. You can see the stitching groover has run a groove around the edges of this piece of leather. Now, on this piece, in this portion, that's just for framing. Again, it's a design piece. I'll show you in a little bit how to use one of those to make the actual groove that you'll run your stitches through. how does the stitching groover work? Very quickly. So stitching groover, there's an adjustment piece right here. It's a screw. Loosen that, and then this bit, which is where the actual groove blade is located, slides back and forth to give you the gap that you want to have for your groove. So place the groover up against the edge of the leather, find your right angle, and pull. Again, make a little noodle of leather here. And the other thing that you do is you carve a little line, a recess into the leather. And what happens is when you run your thread through a stitch line that's got a groove in it, the thread sits down lower in the leather, and it doesn't wear as quickly. Okay, so we've got our piece of leather cut out. We've got the edges beveled. We've got some basic carving and stuff on it. The other thing that you want to do before you really get into the artwork phase is you want to punch the holes that you're going to use to stitch the rectangle into a cylinder. And this is where again, stitching groover will really come into play. So I've got another piece here that already has those holes punched. I do mine about a 1/2 inch in from the edge of either side. So the process, you'll take your stitching groover, get yourself a 1/2 inch gap, and then run that stitching groover along the spot where you want your holes to go. Do it on both sides, like so. And then you will come back with your punch. Now, if you only have the means to make one hole at a time, you'll want to go through and mark with even spacing your holes on either side. What you want to make sure of is that you have the same number of holes on one side as you do on the other, so you might want to count. I do that a lot. If you have a punch tool like this, you can line the punch tool up with the spot where you got your groove line, mallet, punch through, and then you take one prong, place it in the last hole, line it up along the line, and now instead of punching 6 new holes, I'm only punching 5 new holes, but and make sure that I have that correct spacing all the way down. So the next one, and so forth down the line, and then repeat on the other side. For those of you who are a bit more observant, you'll notice that one edge of this particular rectangular piece does not have a bevel on it. So what happens is the edge, the way that I do my beveling is for the top of the mug, I bevel both sides of the leather. For the bottom of the mug, I only bevel the outside or skin portion of the leather. I don't bevel the flesh side because I want that flesh side to sit nice and flush with the wooden plug that we're going to make. And then this side of this piece of leather is going to go underneath the other side. So I don't need to have it beveled. I want to have it squared off. Like so. Okay. Now this is where, at this point, you've got your edges beveled, you've got your holes punched for the barrel of the mug. This is the time to go through and do all of your artwork. So if you're going to carve something on the leather, if you're going to paint something on the leather, if you're going to stain the leather, all of those things illustrated here, this is the time to do that. Get all of that stuff done. Don't worry about necessarily sealing the artwork onto the mug in terms of using a finish like a super sheen or lacquer or something like that. You can do that later. So, but this is the time to get the artwork portion of your thing done. Once your artwork is done, it is time to stitch your mug together. To create the barrel of the mug. Another tool here that's very spring clamps. Lots of spring clamps lying around garages and shops that come in very handy here. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up those holes that we punched in the leather earlier. Take that spring clamp, lock that thing into place. Now I don't have to worry about losing my place. Take a section of waxed sinew. I find that a little bit more than 3 feet is enough. The stitch that I'm going to use is called a double needle or saddler stitch. I have found that it is the sturdiest and quickest stitch to use. And we're also going to lock the needles in. How do you lock the needles in? Good question. So, alright, first we thread the needle. And then we want to leave about an inch or so of the sinew. Try and get this so that you can see it. So I'm going to leave a little bit of the sinew behind, and then I'm going to run the needle along the thread, and then I'm going to fold it back, and I'm going to pierce the sinew with the needle through, and then pull this back like that. Now, the needle is basically locked onto the thread. You can pull and pull and pull on this, and it's not going to pull off of the sinew. So, and this is a much lower profile than tying a knot in the sinew. It's called a double needle stitch because you need 2 needles, one on each end. So we're going to do the same thing here. Through. There we go. Now I've got a needle on each end and a length of sinew in between. So my first stitch, I'm going to take, actually before I do that, I have also found that when using a punch like this with a multi-prongs, those holes are not big enough to really be able to run the needles through. It's just, I have found it easier to go back with an awl and to enlarge those holes a little bit. So I push the awl through both holes, and I'll go through and I'll do the same thing all the way down. both sets of holes. It's a little bit time consuming at first, but you are going to wind up saving yourself time in the long run because you've got more space to work with. Now, needle through and through. If you have a stitching pony, I don't have one, but if you have a stitching pony, now would be a great time to use one of those. So, you get the needles about even over on the other end. Now, it's the first line. Now, next stitch through the next hole, through both layers, pull the needle through, pull the slack through, but don't pull any further. Then we go to the same hole, but on the inside. Hello. Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why I go through with the awl and I open those holes up a little bit more. Because now you've got one piece of waxed sinew and you're trying to fit another needle through the same spot, going the opposite direction. So the first needle went skin side into the flesh side, and then the second needle is going from the flesh side to the skin side through the same hole. Now, take up the slack. Try to make sure that your needles are fairly even. And then pull it taut. You're ready for your next stitch. Again, through the skin of the first, through the skin of the second, and now I've got one needle on the flesh side. Pull it out, take up the slack. Then come through on the flesh side. Needle goes through flesh side of the first layer, flesh side of the second layer, through, take up the slack, and then pull tight. Now, your stitches are going to start to look about like that. So what you're doing is you're weaving, if my hands represent pieces of the thread, you're weaving the thread through itself and then back again. And now I have two pieces so that if one of those threads breaks, there's still another piece of thread or sinew holding that same spot together. And so we stitch and we stitch and we stitch, and we end up with the stitching line about like so. Now, so that sort of finishes the artsy phase of the way that I make leather mugs. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into the construction phase. There's a couple of decisions to be made at this point. Do you want a handle on your mug? If you do want a handle, there are lots and lots of options. I have used in the past deer antler. You can see Sir Vincente and Jarl Jason. Yeah, Vincente and Jason both have antlers as handles on the mugs that I've made for them. I have used chainmail in the past to make handles. I have used just plain pieces of wood cut. Then the most typical thing that I do is I make sort of a layer cake. So I take a piece of 1 inch or 1 by just pine, and I cut out a handle shape. You can see on the inside here where I stop the wood. So the wood stops there for the handle. And then I use contact cement to cement pieces of leather on either side of the wood, and those pieces of leather have tabs on them, like so. What I do is, with those tabs, I bring it over to the mug. I line everything up, usually over top of where the seam is, about like so. And then, again, handy dandy spring clamps. Use a couple of spring clamps to hold that in place while I punch holes through the tabs of the handle and then the tabs of the barrel. How the heck do you get to punch holes through there without having to just stab them through with an awl? Piece of 2x4 scrap fits inside of the barrel of my mugs very nicely, and so it provides me with a solid surface to go through and use my punch. As I was saying, use a punch to get me some spots to stitch the handle onto the barrel of the mug. And you can see a finished example of that here. Okay, so you've chosen your handle. If you even want one at all, and you have attached it, I definitely absolutely recommend doing the handle attachment before putting the bottom of the mug into place. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier. Next thing you want to do is make yourself the bottom of the mug. I have in the past taken several layers of that thick leather that we use to make the barrel of the mug, cut them into discs, glued them together, and then stitched them onto the bottom of a mug to reduce the weight. But I have found that the easiest way is to make a wooden plug. The way that I make the wooden plug is pretty simple. Take the barrel of the mug, lay it on top of the piece of wood. Playing a piece of wood today will be a piece of leather. Pencil, Sharpie, pen, and then go around the inside of the mug, down on the bottom, making sure that when you trace it on, you trace on this notch. The notch that's created right there. There we go. That's a better angle. That notch that's created right there, you need to make sure that you trace that onto the wood, because you need to cut that into the wood so that your wooden plug looks like this. There's the tracing lines. you can see where here I traced that notch in. So when you're ready, what you will do is take that piece of wood, fit it into the bottom of the mug. One of the things I will say is when you cut your disc out, leave the line. So you've got your tracing line in there, cut so that that line gets left behind. It gives you a bit more material, and as most woodworkers know, it's a lot easier to take away a little bit of material using a belt sander or even a piece of sandpaper than it is to try and add more material with something else later. So take the mug, and what we're going to do is we're going to fit that notch, match the notch in the leather up with the notch in the wood. Slide the plug into place as a dry fit, just to make sure that everything is nice and snug. No massive gaps anywhere. Then put some glue on the plug. I'm not going to do this part because I am probably going to wind up making this into a legitimate mug. So, glue. Wood glue is fine. I have this guy's wood glue all along the edge of your disc. You know that everything fits nicely, and so refit it. Slide it back into place. Clean off your excess glue on the outside. Don't really need to worry about it on the inside. But there, at that point, you have a mug that has been put together. Let that glue dry. Come back to it the next day, and you're going to begin the process of sealing the mug. What do you use for sealing? Hey, good question. I use a product called Flex Seal. Yes, the same stuff that guy talks about on TV. I have documentation that I can show you that this stuff is food safe. So, and I have tested it quite a bit myself before using it.